Hello, everybody. My name's Simon Fox. We're still on the ground today, so this will be more informal and more intimate than I was expecting, which is quite a nice thing, really. I'm a doctorate student at Teesside University, public health. My background is occupational therapy and the care of older people and palliative care. So I segue from that, from OT into public health, because they do like to leave breadcrumbs. Come and do a master's, come and do a doctorate. So I did. Right, so let's see if this works. Yeah. Or not. Does the door need to be open? One second.
Sorry.
That's okay, no problem.
Oh, I don't know what I'm looking for.
Let's work in a second.
No, it might be a USB dongle.
Yeah, there is a USB. This.
Yeah. Okay,
So
so
with
turn on here.
where have you all come from today?
Oh, right. Yeah.
Can't see the next slide.
That might be why.
Oh,
So pretty local,
Right.
localish.
Oh, right, it's working now. Yeah, I think it just needs to be focused. It's,
we can only have to store.
I think it'd be okay.
Sorry, Simon.
Don't worry, don't worry.
English is the most common place.
Oh. Yeah, well, Beamish is brilliant. Though. I love Beamish. Okay, so the agenda today, there's kind of a sub-theme of science fiction here. So if you're a fan, that's brilliant. The Invisible Man is meant to be fiction, but who are the real invisible people? What makes them invisible, and what continues to make them invisible throughout their lives? Okay, so we'll be looking at that, but we'll be looking at it through a public health lens and ending with some implications and recommendations if I don't look at the times up, which is pretty rapid. Okay, so what is invisibility? I conducted a doctorate level study, public health, on the healthy aging of aging LGBT+ populations. And this was with a view to looking at their lives and the accumulated stresses throughout their lives and how they culminate in positive and negative health outcomes, and how that inhibits or promotes the ability to engage with healthy aging practices. By healthy aging, I mean good socialization, exercise. Socialization is a very big one, and good nutrition as well, as laid down by the World Health Organization. Everybody gives a nervous giggle when I say this. The catchment sample was 44 years and up. So yeah, in the middle of this study, I've accidentally passed into this. So I've accidentally captured myself as well. So the people that we're looking at today and we're considering are our current workforce, and also retired people. So these are the influences on the people who are still in work, who are still contributing to the economy. And there's an undercurrent of economy in this as well, because LGBTQ+ fortunes tie closely with the economy. Okay, so what the study found was there was particular characteristics of invisibility. I looked at the social determinants. Social determinants in public health terms mean the things that are beyond our control when we are born. I'm probably preaching to the converted here. So it's things like your class, your schooling, your location, access to green spaces, access to healthcare, all the important things to our health. There's some things we do have control over, but your formative years are instrumental in that. So I would argue that LGBTQ plus social determinants are population unique. This is already in the existing literature. So Mayer, who came up with the idea of minority stress, and that is the accumulation of population-specific stresses with negative health outcomes throughout life. So we look, the study looks at the accumulation throughout life and the health outcomes at the end, and how that affected aging in general and engagement with healthy aging. I found that there was generational aspects. This has already been sort of looked into by Fredericks and Galton, who is a brilliant author. Go look them up. They're absolutely fantastic. They really informed this study. There's generational aspects in that it was different from generations to generations. So people in currently in their 40s or 50s were different to people in the 60s and 70s. The sample that I got from the study was important to this because I got people in their 70s, 60s, 50s, and 40s. So a really broad range. It was, but bear in mind, these are all indicative rather than representational, because unfortunately a little thing called the coronavirus pandemic came along in the middle of my study and I sort of had to change all my plans, and it really hemmed me in, but I did my best. So as a result, this turned, although it's a doctorate study, it's kind of like a pilot study, because it could be anything else in those circumstances. I also found out that there were genders. There was a gender divide between those identifying as female and those identifying as male, particularly with engagement with sport and engagement with socialisation. Those identifying as male were particularly vocal about being disadvantaged as far as sport is concerned, and particularly lessons in school, and excluding themselves from gym, or being felt they were being excluded from gyms. But we'll return to that later. Furthermore, although I'm saying that the effects were generational, in that they changed from the social determinants changed from generation to generation, the modus operandi was different, but the effects were the same. So we'll look into today how those repeated social determinants repeated throughout the decades. Okay, so I always try and work as hard as I can somewhere. Yes, I am a geek. It's at this point that I'd just like to put a little extra bit in. It's Windrush Day today, and yeah, the first government official that stepped foot on Windrush was a man called Ivor Cummins, and he's a bit of a hero of mine since I discovered about him in the course of my research. And he was an out gay black man from Hartlepool. So there's a connection there. There's not a lot on him on the internet. At one point, I would like to delve further into the research in my own time. I'd love to see more published on it, because
Still hanging monkeys.
well, exactly.
In a non-racist way.
Yeah, he was just absolutely. He was out and proud, and he proclaimed himself as being queer before decriminalisation. So they chose him to go and step onto the Windrush and welcome everybody in. So I just thought I'd put that in with the Windrush Day. Okay, so to illustrate, when the present older workforce and retired LGBTQ plus populations were growing up, same-sex activity was still decriminalised. So that includes, in my sample, the older populations who are currently retired and were working throughout the back half of the 20th century into the 21st. And they're still very active in a voluntary capacity in society, volunteering at NHS and charities. By the late 60s and 70s, grassroots activism had begun to spring up in society. The GLF had started, and Pride marches started in London, but by that time, they have been sidelined have been made invisible through meeting the expected milestones. Part of the theoretical foundations of the study was Zara Ahmed's queer phenomenology, which says that people are expected to hit certain milestones, like meeting a girl, if you're a man, meeting a girl, getting married, having kids, becoming grandparents. So they were already well on their way, and they felt distanced from all of these changes that went on in society, because now we've got the tendency to look back and say, oh, well, everything was great from the 70s onwards because you got 5 arches and everything. But what about the people who were left behind? What about the people invisible, not only to the rest of society, but LGBTQ plus as well? And there's a big argument that that extends into aging as well, because there's inherent ageism in LGBTQ plus communities. Okay, by the 70s and 80s, the younger study participants were born, and I'll come back to this. And the younger study participants recalled the tombstone ads from the 80s tombstone ads that were on at the time, and combined with the lack of information that they didn't receive through Section 28, they expected to have a short lifespan once they realised that they were gay. So it's potentially life limiting. Part of the theoretical foundations of the study is the potential for self-fulfilling prophecy. There was stereotype embodiment theory, which speculates that the way you interact and see older people in your formative years heavily influences your health outcomes, and thus how you age as well. So if you have a good relationship with grandparents, you don't particularly see them as old, more than likely is that you will age healthily yourself. But if the reverse is true, then okay. So okay, so the new century brought with it sweeping legislative change: the Equality Act, Gender Recognition Act, Same-Sex Marriage Act, and it would have a profound impact on the health outcomes of populations. More so with those who got married in my population sample, because they saw it as a steadying influence. They saw it as a legitimization of their own voice. Because if we look back on the previous slide, pre-decriminalization and after it, actually, the only voice available to us in history are the police records, the court records of those who got arrested. There are a few other things floating around, but the vast majority are, well, histories written by the victims. So it's a gradual turn towards LGBTQ plus voices legitimizing themselves and being their own foundations. But again, it reached across generations the effects of being same-sex marriage, in that those who were in heterosexual marriages, who are now in the 70s, so they grew up in the 50s and 60s, they were in work by the late 60s, 70s, and 80s. There was one participant who was married to a woman, and then who was married to a man later on in life. So capable of great change, of being able to embrace that legislation. And that also has other effects, which I'll get on to. Okay, but also coming up as well, I'll look into how the Equality Act 2010 could also potentially, how it's, not the Equality Act in itself, but how it's used, could be used to silence future generations. Okay. So, hopping back a bit, for the present older LGBTQ plus populations, it was an incredibly hostile environment. So these are older workers, present volunteers, and retired people. At the time, the authorities were seeking to re-establish heteronormative family units after the war, because during the war, there's a great book called there was a war on, everybody was concentrating on the war. So, you know, people found comfort where they could, self-expression, and then afterwards, authorities and tried to re-establish the family unit to go forward, and it was a time of economic change as well. Again, the economy link. I was really surprised at that link, actually. I wasn't looking for it, and I love how things come out through the study. Okay, where was I? Okay, so that forced the at the time LGBTQ plus voices during the war were still clandestine, but they were tolerated. I hate that word. Still not the better word. They were tolerated at the time, but then it was forcibly removed and back into the hands of structure and structural institutions. So they were at the time they were pathologized as well by the medical and healthcare professions. So there's another great book called Curing Queers by Paul Dickinson. And relevant to today, the first female to male transition in the UK was in 1945. 1945, and if you look at the headlines today, it's nearly 100 years. It'll be 100 years before we know it. So, yeah, what's going on? That was Michael Dillon, by the way. Yeah. There we go. But that didn't stop LGBTQ plus life from existing. Of course, because people are people. We're sociable animals. We need to meet up and we need to socialize. And again, it's that socialization aspect. Okay, I've picked out these two fantasy books. It's fine if you haven't read them or never heard of them. There was a really nice, really good version of The City and the City. I think it's on BritBox. But both of these books have the central fantasy idea of there being a hidden city within cities. That if you look at them or you interact with them, you're immediately shunned from the city that everyone else lives in. And in effect, that's how it works for LGBTQ plus spaces as well. Because they existed in the in-between spaces and they were hidden from view. And sometimes heteronormative spaces mapped onto LGBTQ plus spaces. And that's where prosecutions stand on public toilets, public parks. The more they were delegitimized, when they were proper premises, they were shunted out into public areas. And that's where the prosecutions happened, where one space was mapped onto the other. And this is where it was at this time, and in this method, that Canal Street in Manchester was established. In that it was the changing fortunes of Manchester post-war meant that some previously busy industrial areas suddenly became dead. And that's when the new uni opened in a semi-derelict area. And for want of a better phrase. Of course, police raids and prosecutions still happened. I've read one admittedly anecdotal account that gay and bi men used to team up with female sex workers and pretend to be boyfriend and girlfriend if the police raids happened to evade prosecution. So that's an example of moving into these areas. Another analogy that I like to we've started about the other day was when you look into a mirror, what do you see? You see yourself and your home in the background, but you never see beyond the mirror. So you can't reach into that world, but you assume that it's going to be like you, but what's really happening behind the mirror? And that's kind of what happens with heteronormativity reaching into LGBTQ plus spaces, and that's where conflicts can arise.
I hope you don't make this comment. I always remember that next song, Sing If You're Happy to Be. And it just shows you how far.
Tom Robinson, yeah. Tom Robinson. Oh, I love that. I discovered that during the study. and I played it over and over and over. It's marvelous.
So it's like you fight about the police prosecuting people because age 16, I was one of the people who was kicked out by my parents. So it's the older people who was actually prosecuted prior to 1967 or decriminalisation in Scotland in 1980.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah, exactly.
they actually took the people like me who was disowned by parents underneath the wing and showed how the community worked in an sexual.
I don't know about you, but 1980, I mean, I was a kid then, but it still seems like 2 minutes ago. It's not that far away. Someone said 1980, you know.
I'll try when Joe Dalton put a picture in Margaret Thatcher going bang, bang, bang.
Yeah. He's on YouTube, and it's a great performance that he gives. I absolutely love Tom Robinson, brilliant voice. And the lyrics are brutal, as they needed to be. Okay, right. Okay, so what effects did this have on the populations? Concealment. I was really pleased with the sample that I got. I got a whole load of anonymous online survey responses, and because it was qualitative, led mixed methods, a handful of interviewees, and it was an hour interview, and I've always intended to do a one-shot interview with method checking instead of a check on it. Only one person decided to check on it, and that was to expand, because I discovered that the participants really wanted to tell a story because no one's asking, and they were over the moon. They said, "Oh my God, someone's interested." Yes, very much so, and I want to get more people interested in this. That's very much in the line of Drew's thinking, isn't it? So this led to concealment of sexuality in education. There's some pretty horrific stories which weren't a part of that. Concealment of sexuality at work, particularly. There was some ex-teachers who said they had to conceal who they were. There was ex-doctors, a paediatrician, who couldn't come out because they were frightened of being branded a paedophile. Yeah, beggars belief, doesn't it? There was exposed to structural violence, which is structural violence. What I mean by this in the Foucauldian sense is the violence of institutions on individuals and the limiting of their choices. And exposure to cultural discrimination, impact on mental health, denial of promotion, having to conceal yourself at work, having to lie, play the pronoun game, and yeah, and that led to kind of a loss of income, a limiting of income, so already disadvantaging. And again, that's the economic aspect. Okay. Now let's zoom forward to the 80s and 90s. Speaking of the devil, and again, was it so different to the 80s and 90s? And when I came to put this presentation together, I really started to pick it apart. Yeah, there are similarities. Societal and economic change. Late 70s and the 80s, the red braces brigade, and and so on. Social mobility and aspirations, and suddenly there was an onus on family life, and Section 28 was actually part of that. And as Margaret Thatcher said, children growing up with believing they have the inalienable right to be gay. Unequal laws and legislation, because again, decriminalised. But when people say, "Oh, it was decriminalised in 1967," not strictly true, because it's a process, like everything else is a process.
Until a few years ago, people could be arrested for shooting.
Well, this is it. This is it. It's a lot more complex than the sound bites that are so loved today. Police persecution. During my first degree, all that time ago in the 90s, and I worked in a gay club in London, and this is what eventually led to me studying that, I think, years later. And the older crowd would regale me with stories about how the police used to invade the Royal Vauxhall Tavern and the drag queen will put on a pair of rubber gloves and chase them out. They might have been really savage. Could be Israeli. Yeah, yeah. They swear they were there that night, but I think it's like, oh, I was definitely there at the cabin when the Beatles played. You know, there were a lot of people there. But never mind, it's a good story. Also, the AIDS epidemic and the healthcare response, and particularly the media response as well. I personally see a lot of similarities and a lot of echoes with the media headlines that we get today to do with COVID and the trans community as well, with the persecution. And again, it's the media headlines that were forefront in the participants who grew up during the 1980s. It really stuck with them. There was some, you know, like there was lots of laughter in the study and everything, but the really serious bits were always, this is what was being said in the media. But at the same time, remember, there was no information, there was no internet, there was no Google. Google was a sound debate made, you know, and now that.
Sad death of the root, long sorrow also knows what
Yeah.
if it been 6 months later, drugs actually help them.
Well, quite absolutely. But this thing, there was no information whatsoever. And with Section 28 as well, I remember growing up in the 90s, and there was very little, early 90s, there was very little information going around. So there was a few groups, but that was about it, and even that was hampered. Okay. So what was the impact on the health outcomes? As I said, self-perceived short life expectancy. The mental burden of that is huge and is still being felt by the current older workforce. And when I say older, I think mid-40s, from 40s onwards. And people voluntary work and the retired. Because, and more than one participant actually said they would still regularly question themselves, am I a good person? Am I moral? And they know that this stems from this. And that's one of the positive things I found was the, well, some in a way negative, in a way positive, the self-awareness. And it was forced out, this self-awareness, because the constant identifying of risks, the constant risk assessments in social situations, and it gives you self-awareness and hypervigilance. Internalized homophobia, that kind of dovetails with that on the Venn diagram. And the censorship from Section 28, and you're a teenager, hormones flying about willy-nilly, and there's no information, led to risk behavior, sexual risk behaviors, which had more of a potential to lead to a higher risk of transmission. Well, absolutely, and this was the point, and they said they had role models there who clearly wanted to help these people, but they weren't allowed. So this potentially, in public health terms, led to higher risk of transmission as well after a precipitous time during the 80s and 90s. Yeah, and again, with lack of guidance and role models, teachers weren't allowed to say anything, and well, community leaders. Barriers to healthcare access as well, because it was only recently, in the 90s, that World Health Organization, I think, took sexual minorities off the mental disorders list. I still find that flabbergasting. Yeah, so
I've got to take it for Alan Turing, you know, a hero, and what do the UK government do? Put him on the back of £50 notice.
Yeah, exactly. Alan Turing is a case in point as well, and yeah, he's held up as an example of everything that I'm talking about. So social risk assessments and fatigue. A big thing that came out of the study was coming out, and constantly coming out in soap operas You come out once and everybody knows and it's all okay, and then you get shunted off. You get written out. Life's not a safe opera unless you live in lessons.
That first kiss on Easter.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the point. Yeah, so when you come out, or when you're thinking about coming out, you risk assess the situation. Am I going to get verbal or physical reprisals? This constant risk assessment, how do I look, how to address. I do it all the time, every single day. And like walking on the street in a city I don't know, like Sunderland, and this morning I was thinking, okay, first I got my phone out. Someone going to mug me because I got my phone out. No, everybody's got the phones out nowadays. So, that's fine. Do I look gay? And I catch myself saying that. But more importantly, the participants think that as well. So when it comes to work situations like this, one of the participants called it the pronoun game, where they say, oh yes, my partner does this. They think this, they think that, they say this. And then the risk assessment after a few minutes, or after a drink or two, they might say, oh, he or she.
On cisgender people, you're the talking.
Yeah.
Good.
But it's that moment, it's that flicker that they described, and that flicker, that moment, oh, right, okay. And they said that a friend had asked them why it's such a big deal, and they replied to the friend, when you talk about your wife, is there any reaction? So over time, over the life course, I found that there was more and more fatigue, and that's one of the unique stressors. And it's a heavy mental burden. Okay, trauma, depression, and anxiety from the formative years, that often comes back in times of stress, as reported by many participants. I was quite surprised at that, but it was indicative of the self-awareness through the pressures of the formative years, because you have to watch everything you do, you have to question yourself more than most people, other populations would, and enforced concealment of work, which I've already covered. And actually, some said even past equality, the Equality Act 2010, bosses are still saying, probably best not to mention again in this interview, because it could harm your promotion. It's still happening, despite the law. Okay, long-term health outcomes. So how does this affect healthy aging, which is what we're segueing into after all that background? Okay, the cumulative population unique minority stresses. Minority stress, Mayor 2003. Really good. Everybody quotes him quite rightly. So he was the first person to say these are the cumulative stresses which we've looked at today. I hope that I've added a little bit to it, into the mechanisms, and that was the most exciting bit of the study, was looking at the mechanisms of how this works. When I was a kid, I used to take apart my dad's old radios and see how it works, and still doing it. Yeah, heavy burden of physical and mental health, because of course all these stresses have a physical impact as well. So we're talking about the sexual risk behaviours, HIV. We're talking about heart problems as well, because isolation and loneliness can literally kill. And there was a prevalence of cancers and anxiety as well. None of this, it contradicts the existing literature. It's just a bit more information on the mechanisms behind it. So it was all borne out by the study. Okay, so now you can, I'm sure you can appreciate all the impacts from the birth, education, work, families, and older age, the different agents of invisibility throughout life, shunting you to the side. Hello, Drew.
Hi.
Yeah, shunting you to the side, but also accumulating over time. And the impacts that has by the time you reach older age, by the time you reach your 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and beyond, and that has a massive impact on your ability to engage with healthy aging and so on. Okay, getting back to this point, earlier I made the point about the Equality Act 2010. Part of the study was, the outcome of the study was to produce a toolkit for health and social care professionals in contact with aging LGBTQ+ populations. America is great on this. Scandinavia, I love Scandinavian healthcare people because they're so forward thinking, especially in OT, weirdly. But in England, sweet echo. There was, I found 6, I think, maybe 5, maybe 6 toolkits specifically designed. Most were regurgitated out of date secondary evidence. There was 1 or 2. Catherine Almack, who is a brilliant practitioner, she came up with one that was based on primary evidence. So the outcome of my study is to base it on the primary evidence and up-to-date secondary evidence. So part of it was critically reviewing the existing toolkits. And I found that with the emphasis in my study on the impact of personal and societal history on aging health outcomes, that the LGBTQ+ history sections in most of these toolkits and most literature start from 2010. Like, it's ground zero. Nothing existed before, because in 2010 the Equality Act came in and we all skipped off down the yellow brick road. Brilliant. Not so. But what's the effects of missing out on it? I think it comes, I don't think there's any great conspiracy theory behind it, because I'm not a conspiracy theory person. It's just shorthand. It's shorthand. It's a shortcut. And don't we all take shortcuts? And it's sound bites. So 2010, it's current legislation, which is more relevant to current practitioners. You need to know this is it in a nutshell. But what it does is it erases LGBTQ+ history as a social determinant of the current health outcomes of aging LGBTQ+ people. So, but without the cause and the causes of the causes, how can we understand the effects and the current health burdens? You tell me. So yes, that's another matter of invisibility. So everything that we discussed is more or less invisible or out of date. If it is there, quite often it's out of date or misreported. And again, it's 1967 decriminalisation. It was partial. It was if you were a teenager, 21, in a house with no other people in the house, otherwise you're prosecuted. That's partial. Oh, 5 minutes left. Thank you very much. No, that's all right. I am rubbish at timing. So end on a positive note. Yeah, so what do invisible people do all day? They're very, very busy. They're really busy. Because if you spend a lifetime on the margins, no one's looking at you, you're going to do things your way. So they reject not only ageist views of how you should be, they go out, they have fun, they socialize where they can. Isolation is a problem, but for those who can, they go out and have fun. They there was classic car maintenance, there was motorbiking, there was kayaking, tennis tournaments, you know, Tai Chi. Oh, I love these people, they're brilliant. And do you know what? And they still go out and have one night stands, and they still go out and it's fantastic. You know, but no one's looking at them. So, and no one's ever looked at them because they're shunted to one side. And when you get older, you're shunted to one side because you're older. So you've got a double whammy. I love that phrase, double whammy. You've got a double whammy of invisibility. So you've got 2 shields. So if no one's looking at you, you might as well do what you want, and these guys do. Chosen families are of great importance. There were some of the participants had just acquaintances and a very weak support structure in getting older. Some had biological family and chosen family, and particularly where same-sex marriage was concerned, they were the strongest support networks. And they felt that they were the most secure going into the future. Yeah, and one final note is about care homes. There was a particular anxiety about care homes in that if you spend your entire life doing what you want because no one wants to know you, and then having to go into a heteronormative environment where 2 women in a bed, 2 men in a bed, a trans person, what have you. And it was a really big fear about care homes. That's the next thing I want to look at is care homes and what can be done. Some people said, oh, have LGBTQ plus care homes, and then some people disagreed and they said, no, what we need is champions in the care homes. So I don't know what the solution is, just put it out there. Okay, 1 minute. I just want to end on this point. Looking at today, what problems or challenges, should I say, public health challenges are storing up for the current 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds as they get older. Are we so, is today so different economically? Law? Can we use public health concepts to predict to some extent? To some extent, social determinants are a given concept, I think, but social media and the effects of the coronavirus pandemic, there's so much research, but it's far too soon. Thank you. Thank you for listening. I very much appreciate it.